Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram.
Everybody else was all excited, but I was pretty skeptical about the whole thing. Still, I was the first one off the bus and found myself running immediately into the temple. Even though I'd never been there, I somehow knew all the turns to make in order to get to where Maharajji was. As I came around the corner, he started bouncing up and down and exclaiming all these things in Hindi that totally confused me. I came to him and bowed down at his feet. He began to hit me really very hard. I had both a sense of great confusion and a feeling of the most incredible at oneness that I've ever felt in my life. He was so totally different from what I had expected, yet so familiar at the same time. At that moment, I felt all the suffering, all the pain from the last several years dissolve completely. And though the pain was to come back again in the future, the love I felt at that moment made it all a lot less painful later.
Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram Ram.
I had heard of Maharajji while wandering in India, and I finally found him in Allahabad. My first meeting was in the early morning. Maharajji was in a room on the bed with a ma sitting before him on the floor. There was fruit on the bed. Then out from under the big blanket came this hand. He took some big apples and kept bouncing them off the ma's chest. But she was totally absorbed in meditation. I sat watching. Then suddenly Maharajji looked directly at me. He was like a tree, so grounded, so organic. He flipped me a banana and it landed right in my hand. I wondered what I should do with the banana, a sacred object. I figured it would be best to eat it.
Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Ram.
I had come to India from the United States as a devotee in a very intense religious sect. The Guru was the Guru, the final and great savior. After only 2 weeks in his presence, I was dearly disillusioned about him and began to wander about India on my own, still hoping to find the one true and pure Guru somewhere. Several times in my wanderings, someone would tell me of Maharajji and that he was nearby. But I would not go, as I felt no particular pull. Finally, I was down near Bombay, still seeking the true Guru, when an old friend showed up. He looked so clear and light that before we even spoke, I determined to go to wherever it was he had just come from. He had just left Maharajji in Vrindavan. I packed my bags and was gone that afternoon. 24 hours later, I was before Maharajji. There were a number of Westerners there. Maharajji did not speak to me, but he kept looking very intently at my heart chakra. And what I kept hearing as a voice within me was that my search was over. I had come home.
Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram Ram.
I was sitting for several months in Buddhist meditation in Bodh Gaya. About 2/3 of the way through the second month, this funny looking little man started to appear in the upper right hand corner of my awareness. Every so often he'd smile. I wondered who he was and just watched him come and go. Later, I began to suspect that it was Maharajji, whom I'd heard about the year before. At the end of the retreat, I opened a copy of the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa, and a picture of Maharajji fell out. When we finally got to Brindaban, where he was supposed to be, we found the gates of the temple locked. Feeling very sad that I had come all this way only to find the gates locked, I went across the street and sat on the culvert. All of a sudden, I felt as if Maharajji had come leaping over the wall, for I was completely surrounded and filled with the greatest love I had ever experienced. I burst into tears. People passing by saw this crazy, long-haired Westerner sobbing his guts out. They just looked at me and smiled and continued on. I didn't know what was going on, but I had the clear sense of being home. There was absolutely no question that I was exactly where I wanted to be. A month before, I couldn't have imagined such an experience, but here I was, so relieved, so happy. My heart seemed to have burst open. Shortly afterward, we were allowed into the temple. Maharajji asked me all the usual questions, like who I was and where I was from and what I did. And then suddenly I found myself bowing, with my head at his feet, and feeling totally right about it. And he was patting me on the head, saying something like, "Welcome, glad to see you made it, welcome aboard." All I wanted to do was to hang on to his feet, and I didn't care at all that this wasn't in any way consistent with my self-image.
Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Ram.
My wife had met Maharajji and had come to get me in America and bring me back to meet him. When we first went to see Maharajji, I was put off by what I saw. All these crazy Westerners wearing white clothes and hanging around this fat old man in a blanket. More than anything else, I hated seeing Westerners touch his feet. On my first day there, he totally ignored me. But after the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh day, during which he also ignored me, I began to grow very upset. I felt no love for him. In fact, I felt nothing. I decided that my wife had been captured by some crazy cult. By the end of the week, I was ready to leave. We were staying at the hotel up in Nainital, and on the 8th day, I told my wife that I wasn't feeling well. I spent the day walking around the lake, thinking that if my wife was so involved in something that was clearly not for me, it must mean that our marriage was at an end. I looked at the flowers, the mountains, and the reflections in the lake, but nothing could dispel my depression. And then I did something that I had really never done in my adult life. I prayed. I asked God, "What am I doing here? Who is this man? These people are all crazy. I don't belong here." Just then I remembered the phrase, "Had ye but faith, ye would not need miracles." Okay, God, I don't have any faith. Send me a miracle. I kept looking for a rainbow, but nothing happened. So I decided to leave the next day. The next morning, we took a taxi down to Kainchi to the temple to say goodbye. Although I didn't like Maharajji, I thought I'd just be very honest and have it out with him. We got to Kainchi before anyone else was there, and we sat in front of his tucket, a wooden bed, on the porch. Maharajji had not yet come out from inside the room. There was some fruit on the tucket, and one of the apples had fallen on the ground, so I bent over to pick it up. Just then Maharajji came out of his room and stepped on my hand, pinning me to the ground. So there I was, on my knees, touching his foot, in that position I detested. How ludicrous! He looked down at me and asked, "Where were you yesterday?" Then he asked, "Were you at the lake?" When he said the word lake to me, I began to get this strange feeling at the base of my spine, and my whole body tingled. It felt very strange. He asked me, "What were you doing at the lake?" I began to feel very tight. Then he asked, "Were you horseback riding?" "No." "Were you boating?" "No." "Did you go swimming?" "No." Then he leaned over and spoke quietly. "Were you talking to God? Did you ask for something?" When he did that, I fell apart and started to cry like a baby. He pulled me over and started pulling my beard and repeating, "Did you ask for something?" That really felt like my initiation. By then others had arrived, and they were around me, caressing me, and I realized then that almost everyone there had gone through some experience like that. A trivial question such as, "Were you at the lake yesterday?" which had no meaning to anyone else, shattered my perception of reality. It was clear to me that Maharajji saw right through all the illusions. He knew everything. By the way, the next thing he said to me was, "Will you write a book?" That was my welcome. After that, I just wanted to rub his feet.
Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram.
It was in London. I was on a bus with many empty seats. Then an old man carrying a blanket got on the bus and chose to sit on the window seat beside me, so that I had to stand up to let him in. This annoyed me somewhat, but as he sat down, he gave me such a sweet, gentle smile that I forgot my annoyance and sat thinking to myself, "What a sweet old man." Before the bus came to the next stop on its route, I turned to look at him again, but he was gone. The bus had not stopped again since he had gotten on. How could he have gotten off without my standing to let him pass? Later, when I went to India on the advice of a friend who had been there, and I saw a picture of Maharajji, it was the same man. I located Maharajji and found out that on the same day I had seen him on the bus in London carrying a specific plaid blanket, a woman in India had given Maharajji just such a blanket which he was wearing that same day.
Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Shri Ram 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 Ram.
The Indians also came to Maharajji with varying degrees of desire and readiness, but for them it was different. They had grown up in a culture in which holy beings abounded, and the parents of most of them had had gurus. For the family, the guru was a combination of grandfather, worldly and spiritual guide, and reflection or manifestation of God. They often treated Maharajji more as a man and less as a god, and yet at the same time they could surrender more easily to him. For them, surrender was not a personal matter of ego as it was for us. In the group of stories about initial meetings described by some of Maharajji's closest Indian devotees, both the differences of culture and the similarity of opening and love are apparent. I have known Maharajji since I came into this world. My father and mother were both devotees, my father since 1940 and my mother since 1947. Because our parents were devotees and because he was always being discussed in our family, we were all born devotees of him. I first met Maharajji in Bhoali many years ago. Maharajji frequently visited a certain mass home there. I told her that I had heard about him but had never met him, and I asked her to tell me the next time he came. After a week or so, Maharajji came at night. In the morning a message came for me and I went at once. I found him lying on a cot. He looked at me, then closed his eyes for a moment. He knew at once who I was, who I had been before, and what I was going to do in this world. In a few seconds he said, "I am very pleased to see you," which he repeated many times. Maharajji had walked from Nainital to Bowali during the night. He said, "You have brought me here. I shall see you again in Haldwani." Then Maharajji boarded a bus for Almora. People warn me not to take him seriously. Neem Karoli is a big liar. He very seldom tells the truth. You can't depend on him. In any case, I went to Haldwani. After a few days, someone came to my room and told me that Maharajji had come to Haldwani and gave me his address. I saw him then and have been with him ever since. I first met Maharajji in 1950 when I rode with my boss and Maharajji from Nainital to Haldwani. My boss, a government minister, was already a devotee of Maharajji's and had offered him this lift. But I was smoking and acting as if Maharajji was just another person. In 1958, after the death of my mother, I was in Bowali with my father on vacation. We spent a night in the government rest house there, and my father became ill in the night in much pain. They called the Bowali doctor, who gave him an injection, but to no avail. The next day, doctors from Nainital came and said that he needed an emergency gallbladder operation. That same day, I went to consult doctors at the nearby TB sanatorium. Preparations were then underway for a puja to celebrate the opening of a small Hanuman temple built by the doctor there, who was a devotee of Maharajji. I stayed on to watch. Maharajji arrived but stayed hidden. I grew curious to meet him. I heard that Maharajji had put someone in a trance, so I watched a while from a distance before leaving. That evening a messenger from the Nainital bus station came to me and told me to visit a certain Baba Neem Karoli. Since there are so many Babas, I dismissed the message. But at night I went to the bus station and inquired as to who had sent this message, but no one knew. This aroused my curiosity even more. I asked where I could find this Baba Neem Karoli and went there. Maharajji said to me, "Your name is so and so, and your father is very ill." "Yes." "You thought he might die, but God has cured him. Doctors have told you that he should be operated on, but he shouldn't be. He'll be all right." Maharajji gave me 2 or 3 mangoes for my father, which I fed to him, and he began to improve. After a few days Maharajji again called me. I went but didn't touch his feet. I was planning to return to Delhi, and Maharajji said, "You're going to Delhi. You drive too fast. Take your father carefully and he'll be all right." This touched my heart, and I touched Maharajji's feet. My father never had the operation and became very healthy with no relapse.